First, let's set up the DHCP server.
Okay, the next thing we want to do is set up a DHCP server, and we want to do that so our host can get dynamic IP addresses. So we're going to go to Control Panel, and I'm going to go to, in this case, Programs and Features, and we're going to turn Windows features on or off. And notice my current roles here, and this is just one of the new features, or sort of the new look of 2008. Um, Diagnostics, let me just open some of these here. Configuration, and their storage management. That's kind of a neat little, toolkit here, or an overview of your server. I can connect to disk management services. Um, Loading, all right. I can manage, my firewall and security settings. Diagnostics. I can look at event viewer, security logs, group policy management. Um, all kinds of nice tools here. These are my current roles, are the current roles of, you know, of my server. I'm a domain controller. I'm a DNS server. What I want to do is add the role of DHCP, and I'm just going to right-click on roles. I want to go next. I want to go ahead and select the DHCP server, and here we'll go through, and the wizard will actually let you walk through and configure settings. This is kind of an interesting change with 2008. It's a bit more intuitive than the previous method. Remember, you click on Add Remove Programs, you'd add the DHCP server, and then you'd go and configure your scope and options and things like that. Notice our parent domain is pirates.org, preferred DNS server IP version 4 address. We're not going to use WINS. You can use WINS, you can integrate it with DNS, but we won't. We would configure our scope here. So scope name 192.168.80. Our static IP is 100, so let's say, and remember we have a gateway and DNS and router and gateway address of 1 and 2, so let's start at 3 here. And remember that the static IP of our server is 100, so we'll end at 99, 192.168.80.99. Alternatively, we could configure an exclusion. 0, and our gateway is 192.168.80.2. Activate scope. Notice it's a default 6 days. Um, Interesting that you can choose. There's different default options for wireless and for wired. Wireless is a lot less secure than wired, and so the lease expires sooner. In this case, we'll go ahead and activate our scope. We're not going to deal with DHCP version 6. That's up and coming, but chances are in a lot of networks you'll still find just IP version 4. These are the credentials of who has permission to authorize the DHCP server. In this case, we have enterprise admin privileges and the pirates domain tree and the arg forest. Authorization is a very wonderful thing about Microsoft DHCP because it prevents somebody from coming in onto your network and just setting up a rogue DHCP server. They could boot up an unauthorized server and hand out bad IP addresses, do man-in-the-middle attacks, address spoofing, MAC spoofing, host spoofing, all kinds of things, and all kinds of exploits against your network just by running a rogue DHCP server. But by by forcing DHCP servers to be authorized, you can cut down on that security risk. We'll click next. We'll go ahead and click on install. Remember that DHCP it's a four-way handshake process. The host or client boots up initially with a very limited version of the TCP/IP stack and does what's called a DHCP discover broadcast. Then the DHCP server will hear it if it's on the same subnet. Now remember, DHCP discover broadcasts are not routable unless your router is 1542 compliant, RFC compliant, or unless you have a DHCP relay agent on that subnet that can, has the static IP address of a DHCP server on another subnet and it can relay it. So you would need a DHCP server on the same subnet, but anyway, DHCP discover, the client initiates, the server responds with DHCP offer, the client responds with DHCP server request, and then following the DHCP server would respond with a DHCP acknowledgement or ACK. Just sort of an interesting little handshake process when you're doing DHCP. It's almost done here. It's moving. wet my whistle. Drink some tea there. Okay. And here's our DHCP server. And what we want to do is we're going to look at the other way of configuring DHCP as well. Now that we've added the DHCP server role, if we want to go into administrative tools, there's a shortcut, and we're just going to go ahead and put that on our desktop. DHCP and DNS are, along with that directory users and computers, sites and services, and domains and trusts, is a very commonly used tool. Here's sarah.pirates.org, my IP version 4 settings, and we'll just look at some of the options here. If I were to click on properties, this gives me the start IP and the ending IP. The lease duration, I can increase it, decrease it by days, hours, minutes. DNS configuration. Whether or not, what I'm doing with dynamic update, I can enable DNS dynamic updates according to the settings below, or I cannot disable it. Automatic, remember that's, when a host can automatically add its A records. If the host is not capable of doing that, then I can say dynamically update DNS A important records for DHCP clients that do not request updates, and my DHCP server would stand in the gap and do that for them. Here's my address pool, 3 in this case, to 254. Now the problem with that is we would need an exclusion because in this case our server's IP address is 100. So we'll pull that out and we'll look at another way of adding addresses. I have no address leases. I have no MAC reservations. If I were to do a MAC reservation, then it's only going to assign that specific IP address to that machine with that MAC address. So you should always use static IPs for your servers, but if you didn't, then you would at least want to set up a reservation for all of your servers to make sure that they always receive the same IP address. Scope options, again, some of the more common ones, the router option, which is the gateway, and DNS server option, but we can add those pulled on from this pull down list here. So you can configure all kinds of options on your DHCP server. And there are server options as well. Scope options for just a scope, server options for an entire server. We're going to deactivate this scope. Remember, a scope has to be activated, and also the server has to be authorized. In this case, we are authorized, and the green arrow here. The scope was activated. If I were to activate the scope, let me go ahead and activate it. No red arrow. Let me deactivate it. There's the red arrow. So I'm going to delete the scope here, and we'll look at another way. And now we're going to add a scope and do the same thing, but this time we're going to add an exclusion. And 192.168.83, 192.168.80.254 be our last valid IP address. For the exclusion, 192.168, really only have one, and that's 100.80.100. And our lease duration here, we can default to 8 days if we want. Do I want to configure, let's go ahead and set additional options. I want to set the gateway, 192.168.80.2. Now for the DNS servers, we can just type in a name. If I want to resolve Sarah, or I could type in the IP address here, but I want to add Sarah. And Sarah will take care of DNS forwarding to other DNS servers. One server not using it, yes, let's go ahead and activate the scope now, and we'll finish. Now there's our scope. Our scope's active, and here are a range of valid addresses, minus our exclusion of 192.168.80.100.
Now that we have authorized a DHCP server and activated a scope of addresses, let's lease an IP address on a client.
And I'm going to do IP config all. And notice that we have a PIPA, automatic private IP address. Anytime you see 169, so we're not using DHCP. I wouldn't be able to connect at this point and join the domain because there's no connectivity at layer 3. remember, you want to really verify things are functioning at the lower layers before you move up into the higher layers. So I want to verify layer 1, the physical, layer 2, data link, and layer 3, the network layer, are functioning properly. So MAC addresses and IPs. If my DHCP server is set up properly, then I should be able to do this. I'm going to release a PIPA with ipconfig release command. And let me go ahead and renew here. Okay, and here you can see I've leased an IP address from pirates.arg, and it was the first address in the scope, 192.168.83. Here's my subnet mask, 255.255.255.0, so proper subnet mask. My default gateway, 192.168.82. Let's look at all of our options here. And now we can see, we'll go here and we'll look. Our lease, we have 8 days on our lease here before it expires. Again, here's our dynamic IP address. Here's our server. So our domain controller, Sarah, is serving as our DHCP server. And here are our DNS servers. So it's serving as our forwarding DNS server out on the network. And again, our host name is Vicky Van Vista. Okay, now that we've leased an IP address, let's go ahead and join the domain. And on our Vista client workstation, we're going to go to Properties, Advanced System Settings, Computer Name, and we want to go to Change, and we're a member of Workgroup. Now we want to make Vicky Van Vista a part of the domain. And our domain is going to be Pirates. Now we need somebody with administrator credentials, so administrator account or an equivalent account with those credentials and password. And again, this provides a bit of security because not just anybody can join Active Directory. It has to be, the only people who can or who are authorized to join people and computer accounts into the Active Directory database would be someone with, administrator privileges or someone who had been delegated or granted those privileges to add and create computer accounts. And it's going out across the network. It's trying to find our 2008 server. And welcome to the Pirates domain. Must restart our computer. We'll go ahead and restart. Now, there was only a local logon, as you noticed before we joined the domain. Now that we joined the domain, we'll have the option of either logging on locally to our machine using the SAM, the local security account manager, or we can log into the domain. At which point, we will have centralized authentication from any workstation on the network that's a part of that Active Directory domain. So, several login options. There's local only, and then we can log into different domains. Now our desktop settings will still be stored locally on this machine, just as they would if we had logged on locally if we log into the domain, unless we use what's called a roaming user profile. And in a roaming user profile, basically the user can roam around the network to different workstations and they'll still get the same desktop. So they kind of get the feeling that they're logging into their computer, their machine, no matter where they go. And Vicky Van Vista. And again, here's the domain, pirates.org. and our fully qualified domain name, vickyvanvista.pirates.org. And user, other user. Now if I want to log into the domain, I'm going to say pirates, and now what I'll do is I want to log into my domain, and I'm using credentials stored on the 2008 controller, centralized authentication, but I'm logging in on this workstation with those credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and go in as administrator of pirates. When I do that now, for every domain user that I log in as, that's centralized, it will create for me a new desktop. Okay, we're back on 2008 server, and now if we open up DNS and take a peek, notice that it's been updated, dynamically updated with Vicky Van Vista's A record. Now that workstation is joined to the domain, we can take advantage of Active Directory's centralized authentication. So again, let's make a user real quick. Remember we had a local Austin Powers that we made on the local workstation. Now we're going to create one in Active Directory. We'll throw them here in users, or actually, let's go over here and we will let's make a new organizational unit, and we will call this Super Spies. And here, I'm going to go to new, and let's add a user, and Austin Powers, and Austin Powers at pirates.org, and let's go ahead and set up our user's password. So there's Austin Powers. He's in our Super Spies OU. And let's hop over to our Vista client. Now we're on our Vista client, and we want to log in as Austin Powers. I mean, we're logged in as the administrator of Pirates. So, okay, we hopped back over onto our Vista client, and we're logged in as the administrator of Pirates. Let's log in as Austin Powers now. Again, he's in our Pirates domain. So, Pirates, Austin Powers, and password. And in this case, again, it's centralized authentication, so any user account we create in Active Directory can be accessed from any workstation, any computer on the network. And now we'll be creating Austin Powers Desktop. And if you had a roaming user profile, it would have his specific wallpaper and my document settings and applications available to him, no matter where he logged in.
Let's take a look at Secure Dynamic Update and how this DNS feature works in tandem with DHCP.
Okay, we're on our 2008 enterprise server. We need to do some post-installation tasks after we've installed Active Directory and run DC promo. The first thing we want to do is configure DNS forwarding, or a forwarding zone on our DNS server. And the reason is, let's look at the IP configuration settings real quick on our server. Remember, we again changed it to a static IP. We need to do that for our domain controller. We don't want it to be a dynamic IP. But let's look at our settings. So in this case, we have as an alternate DNS 192.168.82, and that's where we want to forward DNS queries to. That's our router. And we'll want to remember this too, the default gateway setting, because that's what we'll need to configure the scope information for when we set up our DHCP server. So we'll just kind of leave that command prompt open. We'll minimize it in the background. Let's open up DNS, and I'm going to go to Sarah, right click. I'm going to go to Properties, and under Forwarders, and in this case, this would not have been here. So let me go ahead and delete that. And what we would have seen would, basically be this. So I'd want to add that zone, 192.168.82. I want to add that router address and DNS server. And all this does, if any of the hosts on our local network try to resolve a hostname to an IP, and our DNS server, our domain controller, DNS server global catalog server here, cannot resolve that hostname to the IP, then it's going to send the request over to 192.168.82. There's a couple other options worth mentioning here. Root hints. Again, I could specify if I want that you use root hints if no forwarders are available. Well, these are like top-level DNS servers on the internet. They don't change very frequently, but you do have the option of adding new ones. You can edit them, and you can remove them, and you can also copy them from a server. Under advanced mode, few nice features here. Disable recursion. Remember we talked about iterative versus recursive queries, but that would help enable greater performance on your DNS servers if they were getting bogged down. Enable round robin has been enabled. Again, that would be if you're using clustering, such as in a web farm. You could have multiple IP addresses mapped to the same host name, and round robin would just go around and around and around in round robin fashion to sort of balance the load between those multiple host names or servers with multiple IP addresses, the same host name with multiple IPs. You can choose the interface that you want to serve DNS out on. Notice that there's a security descriptor, so there's access control entries on a DACL if it loads here. Okay, there we go. And so you can, you have a fine level of control in terms of, what you allow or what you make available to hosts and clients and people on the internet in terms of your DNS servers. Monitoring, we can perform tests for, we can do an iterative simple query and a recursive query, and event logging. We can control all of these things here. Remember that again, you don't want to get bogged down in too much logging unless you're troubleshooting, because that can adversely affect the performance of your server if you're constantly logging lots and lots of things. That's lots of input and output and file access, and it can just really slow things down. Quick review, remember that a forward lookup zone maps, it holds A records, which map a hostname to an IP. A reverse lookup node holds pointer records that maps an IP address to a hostname. In addition, we also have SRV records. So here's pirates.arg, and here's our A record Sarah. It maps the hostname Sarah to the IP address 192.168.80.100. If we were to open it, let's go through here and look at some SRV record information. Here's an SRV record that tells everybody, hey, this is a global catalog server. Sarah.pirates.arg is a global catalog server. It's just advertising a service. It's a password server. It's a Kerberos server for replication and encryption. It's a lightweight directory access protocol server. And again, just mapping the fully qualified domain name. Remember, it starts at the more general on the right and then moves to the more specific towards the left. So in this case, the forest, the domain or tree, and then the host name, sarah.pirates.arg. Here's our domain name. Here's our A record for our server. Now notice there's no A record right now for Vicky Von Vista, which is the name of our Vista workstation client machine. There's just an A record for Sarah, our domain controller. But when we complete the setup process for DHCP, we're going to set up dynamic update, and actually that Vicky Van Vista, our Vista host, will be able to update the A record. So in this case, the A record will appear here in DNS. And again, just to review DNS, remember, now we have this set up to secure dynamic update only. And what this would do is this would not allow a host to update itself unless it had a computer account in Active Directory. We haven't joined Active Directory yet, so I'm going to turn that off temporarily. We'll turn it back on later. Remember the zones, Active Directory integrated is probably the least amount of hassle, although if you use this particular feature, you need to make sure that all your DNS servers are Microsoft 2008 or 2003 or even 2000, but not Linux. Linux uses a bind model. Linux can do dynamic update, but it can't do secure dynamic update. And also, if it's Active Directory integrated, remember that it's not transferred in terms of increments, or it doesn't do zone transfers by time. It's just handled as part of the Active Directory replication process. So it's automatic. It's encrypted by Kerberos. Some very powerful features there. But if you were to change the options, primary zone would be your writable zone if you went to a standard model. Secondary zone would be read-only zones that you could do zone transfers out to. The stub zone in this case just maps different name servers. We'll just leave it as Active Directory integrated. Kind of go with the easiest there. So it's just kind of a quick review there of DNS.